guys, welcome to my SQL series on Learn-In. My name is Nse. Let's get right into it. I have the command line client open here. I'm going to enter my password as always. First, let's show databases so that we can be reminded of the databases that we currently have available. Show databases, semicolon of course, and we'll hit enter. So we have bookstore and these other databases. Let's use the bookstore database. So we'll have use book underscore store with the semicolon. We'll hit enter. Let's be sure that we are using the bookstore database. So we will select database. Remember, we always have parentheses in this case. Semicolon, we'll hit enter. So we are certainly using the bookstore database because that is what is being shown to us here. You're probably wondering where I'm going with all this. Don't worry, we'll soon be there. All right. Now let's see the tables that we have in the bookstore database. So let's show tables. Okay, so we have books table and we have take books table. Let's work with the books table. So let's describe books table. Let's describe books just like that. Hit enter. All right. So this is a description of the books table. In the books table, we have three columns: book ID, book title, and author name. Book ID is given the data type of int. Book title has the data type of varchar with maximum limit of 200. Author name has the data type of varchar with maximum limit of 100. Okay, this is not really what we want to talk about today because I'm sure that we know this by now. Our aim today is to discuss these table headings. We've talked about field, we've talked about type. Remember, we said field shows all the columns that we have available in the table. I just explained that. Type indicates the data type of each of the columns. We talked about null in the previous lesson. If you would want to see that, the link is in the description. But just for the purpose of explaining, we did say that null is going to indicate whether a column can take null values or not. When you have null set to yes, like it is here, it means that book ID can accept null values. Book title can accept null values. Author name can accept null values. Now, key we have not talked about. We've not talked about default. We've not talked about extra. Today, we are going to talk about key, default, and extra. But just before we do that, out of curiosity, let's describe textbooks. I might find something to use in explaining null there. All right, perfect. So still talking about null, if we look at the textbooks description, we are going to notice in the null column that book ID has null set to yes, book title has null set to no. This means that while book ID can accept null values, book title cannot accept null values. All right, that being said, let's proceed to talking about these three headings: key, default, and extra. Let's start with default. The default column represents default values assigned to the different columns on a table. Remember, we are still working with books table, so let's bring it back here just by typing DESC books again. Currently, in the default column, we have null for book ID, we have null for book title, and we have null for author name. These null values are put in here by MySQL. We have not yet set any default value for any of the columns. Now we can set default values for each of our columns, and that is done by using the default keyword when creating a table. Let's see what it looks like. When you want to set a default value for a column, while creating the table, I'm sure we're already used to this create table syntax where you have create table, table name, then we specify the columns that we want. In this case, we want a column named book ID. We are setting the data type to int, and here we have default to specify that this book ID column should have a default value, and we want the default value to be 0. We also have this book title column that we specify in here. We want the data type to be varchar with maximum limit of 200. Then we want a default value also, and then the default value we want to be add title. Okay, let's head back to command line client and put this to use. So here in the command line client, we have the command, just like we said, create table. In this case, we are calling our table library, and we have book ID column and book title column, just like we explained. And this query has been executed just by hitting the enter key of the keyboard. Now, let's describe library. DESC library with semicolon. Let's hit enter. So notice that now in this library table that we have created, if we look in the default column, we don't have null. We have 0 and we have add title. These are the exact values that we specified when creating the table. For book ID, we specified default to be 0. For book title, we specified default to be add title. And that's what we now have in the default column. So what this means is that where there is no value specified for book ID, the value will be set to 0. And where there is no value specified for book title, the value will be add title. Now let's insert into library and see clearly how this works. We have our insert statement, insert into library, book ID, and values set to 1. In this insert statement, we only have book ID specified as the column to insert values. So we are not explicitly inserting a value into the book title column. Let's execute this query and see what happens. Query is okay. Now let's select star from library. Notice that in the library table, we have 1 under book ID. For book title, we have add title. Even though we did not specify add title as a value for book title while inserting into the library table, we have add title here. This comes from the default value that we set for book title. Remember that when you do not explicitly provide a value to be inserted into any column, and that column happens to have a default value specified, then the default value will be used. Let's try another insert. This time, we are not specifying any columns to enter values. We are not specifying any values either. Here, we do not have a value specified for book ID. We do not have a value specified for book title. Let's execute this query and let's see what happens. Query is okay. Let's select from library. Notice that for this new insert, under book ID, we have 0. That's the value added. Under book title, we have add title. Again, this is because while inserting at this point, we did not explicitly specify any values to use. So MySQL is going to fall back to whatever values that we have in this default column. So that's how to set up a default value. I hope that you get the point. Please note, setting a default value is not the same thing as using not null. Remember that in the previous lesson, we talked about not null in detail. When you have a column set to not null, it means that that column cannot be empty. Also, that column cannot accept null being entered explicitly. If you would care to know more about not null, refer to the video on not null. The link is in the description. To demonstrate how not null is different from default, I am going to create a new table. You're trying to create a new table. Create table. It has the name new library, and we have two columns still: book ID, which we are giving the data type of int. We have not null specified, so the book ID cannot be empty and it cannot accept null being typed in explicitly. We also have default value for it. We're setting it to 0. We have book title, data type is varchar 200 max limit. We have default value for book title column and we're setting it to add title. Now let's execute this query. Query is okay. Let's insert into new library. Query is okay. Let's select star from new library. So notice that we have 1 under book ID, just like we specified here. When we're inserting, the value should be 1. And for add title, because we did not specify any title explicitly while inserting into new library, the default value is used, and that default value is add title, just like we have here. Now let's insert into new library again. This time, let's specify the value as null. Now this is us explicitly entering null into the book ID column. Remember that book ID here is set to not null. So let's see what is going to happen when we execute this query, hit enter. We have an error, and the error says column book ID cannot be null. That is because we have not null specified here. So you can see that we can have both default and not null together, serving their distinct purposes. Now, let's describe new library. When we started explaining, I explained with books table, but we have made progress, so it would be better to understand if I now explain using the new library table. So in this table, we are still considering just the headings. We just talked about defaults. So we've talked about this field column, we've talked about type column, we have talked about null column, we've not talked about key column, we've talked about default column, we've not talked about extra. Let's now talk about this key column. Now, it is often necessary to add a unique identifier to a row. By row, I mean this distance from left to right. Remember, that's row. Column is from top to bottom. Like we have field, it's is a column, type is a column, and so on to extra. Rows are now these horizontal lines, or should I say pattern? I don't know what to call it, but row goes from left to right. That's what I mean. It is often necessary to add a unique identifier in a row in order to distinguish it from other rows in a table. This unique identifier is typically achieved using a primary key column. A primary key column is a column that uniquely identifies each row in a table. By defining a primary key, you ensure that each row has a unique identifier which sets it apart from other rows. Let's see how to put that into use. But first, let's insert into new library again. We are inserting into new library. We are not providing value for the book title column. We are only providing for the book ID column. Now let's execute this query. Let's select star from new library. So you can see here that these two rows, the first row and the second row, are very identical. They have the exact same values. One and add title, one under book ID, add title under book title, one under book ID again in the second row, add title on the second row again. One under book ID, add title on the book title. On the two rows that we have in this table. So these two rows have the exact same values. There is no way to distinguish one from another. It is for this reason that a unique identifier is required. Let's see how it's being done. Now for this, I apologize well ahead of time because I'm going to create a new table. I seem to be creating a lot of new tables. You should note that it is possible to alter an existing table, but that has not been taught yet in this series. However, we are familiar with creating tables. That is why I choose to create a table where we need to alter. We will learn how to alter tables very soon. So for now, let's just create a new table, and this time we are calling it Tech Library. So we have a table, Tech Library, that's the name. We have a column, the ID column, and we have set the data type to int, and we have primary key here in the ID column. Having primary key set here guarantees that each value in the ID column will be unique within the Take Library table. We also have another column, that's book title. We are keeping default at enter title. We have another column, author. We are keeping default at enter author. We have their data types to each be varchar. Okay, let's execute this query and see what happens. Query is okay. I'd say let's describe Take Library. So notice that on this Take Library table, in the key column, we have PRI. And we have PRI only on the ID column. This PRI is here because we have primary key on ID column. So what this means is that the primary key column of Take Library table is the ID column. So this column is going to hold the unique identifier in this Take Library table. Now let's insert data into Take Library. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 insert statements. I decided to type them all out and then explain all together so it would be easier, maybe. Insert into Take Library, we are only inserting into ID column and we're giving it the value of 1. So the first row will have the value of 1 under ID column. On the second insert, we're inserting into the ID column again, just the ID column again, and we're giving it the value of 2. So the second row will have 2 under the ID column. The third insert is inserting into the ID column, only the ID column again, and it has the value of 3. So the third value in the ID column is going to be 3. The fourth insert is inserting into only the ID column again, this time with the value of 4. So the fourth value on the ID column is going to be 4. The book title column and author column will both use the default value set here, which is for book title, enter title, and for author, enter author. So let's select star from Take Library. So notice here that all the values in the book title column and in the author column are the same. But under ID, we have different values. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. So it is this ID column that is making each row to be different, because aside having 1 here, remember row goes from left to right. So this highlight here is a row. So aside 1 here, you can see that we have enter title and enter author on all the other rows, rows 2, 3, and 4. But we have this unique values under the ID column. So setting a unique identifier like this is going to help to tell one row apart from another row. I hope that is clear. Now, it is very important to note that the primary key column must always have unique values. It cannot be repeated. Let's say that we try to insert into Take Library just the ID column and we are giving it the value of 4. Keep it in mind that 4 already exists. Let's execute this query. Notice that we have this error. It says duplicate entry 4 for key Take Library dot primary. What this is trying to tell us is that 4 already exists in the ID column, which is the primary key column. And so we cannot assign 4 as an ID in this tech library table. So primary keys always have to be unique. We cannot repeat any of these IDs that we have here in this tech library table. We cannot repeat 1, we can assign 2 anymore, we can assign 3 anymore. Out of curiosity, let's try and assign 1. Let's execute this query. We have the same error, duplicate entry 1 for key. We can't use it. We are not allowed to use it. Another point I want to note here is that primary key is always required. So it cannot be left empty. It does not accept null. This means that you do not have to use not null and primary key in the same column. If you do use it, it's not going to cause any errors, but it's redundant. It's almost like writing the same thing 2 times. So let's just prove that ID column cannot be left empty. Let's insert into tech library again. This time, let's not specify value for any of the columns. Let's execute the query. You can see that we have this error that says field ID doesn't have a default value. So this ID column, if we try to leave it empty at any point, we are not going to get away with it. We will have this error that would prevent us from going further with the insert. Okay, now let's try something else. This time, let's insert into ID, but let's set it to null. And let's execute this query. It clearly tells us that column ID cannot be null. That is because ID is the primary key column. So it is not necessary to have both primary key and not null in the same column. So let's talk about auto increment. Remember that while inserting into tech library, we had to type in values for the ID column, which is the primary key column. We had to type in values at each point of insert. We had to type in 1, we had to type in 2, we had to type in 3, we had to type in 4. Now imagine that you had to insert into many rows. Actually, it would be very, very, very tedious typing out all of this. In fact, it's not even recommended because you could run into manual errors. So you do not have to manually insert the primary key, incrementing the value from one to another like we did while inserting into tech library. MySQL can do that for you. All you have to do is specify the column for the primary key and add auto increment when creating the table. Let's see how the syntax looks. While creating the table, we have the regular create table syntax. Then in this table, where you want to specify the primary key, you indicate it just like we discussed. Indicate the primary key, and then right after it have auto increment written like this with this underscore. Please, it's very important to note that auto increment always has this underscore between auto and increment. So let's demonstrate how that works. I'm sorry, we are going to create another table. This time we are calling it cookbooks. And we have primary key on the ID column and we have auto increment just by it. The book title column with the data type and the default values. Same thing with author with data type and default value. So let's execute this query. Query is okay. Now let's describe cookbooks. So Notice now that in this cookbooks table, we have extra column occupied. We have auto increment under the extra column, and auto increment is on ID because it is the ID column of our table that has auto increment. The same ID column that has the primary key. That's why we have PRI here. So let's insert into cookbooks. Inserting into cookbooks, we insert 4 times. This is the first insert, this is the second insert, this is the third, and this is the fourth. And it's just by typing insert into cookbooks. Notice that we are not providing values for any of the columns. So that's why we do not have any column specified here and we do not have values. Now let's execute this query. Let's select star from cookbooks. Notice that the ID column is populated starting from 1 to 4. 4 here is the number of rows that we have in this table. We have row 1, row 2, row 3, and row 4. Now remember again that while inserting into cookbooks, we did not provide any column and we did not provide any values. The two columns, book title and author, are using the default values that we set for them. Add title for book title and author name for author. That's what we have here, populating the book title column and the author column. But the ID column, we did not specify anything. We did not even have to, because we have auto increment on the ID column. So what MySQL is going to do is it is going to take the column that has primary key and auto increment, in this case the ID column, and it is going to assign values as each row is created. It's going to assign this value from 1 and it's going to increase it up to the number of rows that you have in your table. In our cookbooks table, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. So the highest ID we have here is 4. Now, if we insert one last time into cookbooks, we are still not providing any values for any of the columns. And query is okay. Now let's select star from cookbooks. Notice now that we have 5 because a 5th row has been added. So we can say that the primary key column indicates that a column is the primary key of the table. In the case of cookbooks table, ID is the primary key column, while the extra column can show additional information about the column. Such information as whether auto increment has been enabled. So in this case, we have auto increment enabled on the ID column. That is why we have auto increment under extra, but specific to the ID column. I hope that you get the point. This is it for today. If you have any questions or comments, please say them in the comment section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Learn In. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.